Hi Year 4, Miss Ty here to talk you through this week's reading activities. The book I've chosen is called Goodnight Mr. Tom. Now remember that this week's pack is all about children evacuees in World War II. An evacuee is a person evacuated or taken away from a place of danger, and it's clear that the word war suggests danger. I chose this topic because just a few weeks ago we celebrated the E-Day, Victory in Europe Day, which signalled the end of World War II. It was its 75-year anniversary since the war in Europe ended. I thought it would be interesting to look back at how children's lives were affected at this time. So I'm going to begin by giving you some background and explaining exactly what's meant by a child evacuee in World War II. So when Britain announced in 1939 that it was at war with Germany, the British government knew that Germany would attack with its bomber planes. So in order to protect families, they ordered mothers and children who lived in these cities, they said that they had to leave the cities and go and live in rural areas. Now rural means countryside areas where they were safer. Remember, many of their fathers, many of the men, would have either been working in the war or would have to remain in the cities because they would have been key workers, perhaps butchers, perhaps ambulance drivers, and the same with some of their mum. Although some mothers were evacuated with the children, sadly, this was certainly not always the case, as we will find out. So here we have what's called a tranquility map of England. Now the word tranquil or tranquility means calm, suggests calm. Now we know that towns and villages in the countryside, which are rural areas, farming areas, would not have been targeted by the German bombers as much as cities. So children, it's obvious they would have been much safer living in these rural, these countryside areas. Now if you look closely at the map, the areas in red are the areas which the bombers would target the most, and you can see a lot of these are city areas: London, Coventry, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds, which would have been really densely populated. You can also see down on the south coast there, we've got more red areas, whereas the green areas in the map, they show the rural or the countryside areas where people would have been safe from bombs, and these are the areas that mothers and children were evacuated to. Now if you look at Wales, I think if I had to have been evacuated, I think Wales would have been the place for me. Now incredibly, during this period, more than 3.1 million children were evacuated from the main British cities, which obviously included London. The plan to evacuate them was called Operation Pied Piper, and for those of you who have never heard of the Pied Piper, it's a folktale, a German folktale about a magical musician, you can see him in the picture there, who lured all the children of a town away with his musical pipe, and the children were never seen again. Now, once it was decided, once war was declared and Operation Pied Piper was decided, it all happened very quickly. And you can see one of the posters that was put up around London: mothers, send them out of London, give them a chance of greater safety and help. So the government hoped that these posters would persuade or encourage parents that the best thing for them and their families to do was to evacuate their children, because obviously it would have been an incredibly difficult decision for a family to send their children, some of them quite young, away to stay with a family that they didn't know, to a location that they didn't know. So families were told that the children were only allowed to bring one suitcase with them, and in that they had to have some clothes, their identity card to say who they were, their ration book. Now we're going to talk a little bit more in depth about rationing in a couple of slides, so I'll wait for that. Their gas mask. Now they had these gas masks in case poisonous gas bombs were dropped during an air raid. So Can you imagine how some of them were sitting on the train looking anxiously at their gas mask, wondering if they were ever going to have to use it? They also took with them some money and a few small toys, but not very much at all, as you can see from the pictures, quite small suitcases. Everything had to fit inside that one suitcase, and the children had to keep their suitcases with them at all time as they were travelling to this rural area. Now, for those of you mums who might be listening out there, that would have been quite a task for young children to remember to keep hold of their bags. So a lot of responsibility. Now, this picture here really is quite moving, because it's mums saying goodbye to their children, and you can see some of them are quite young, 4, maybe 5, and some older children in the background. But the evacuation happened so quickly that some children didn't know where they were being sent. Many children had never been separated from their parents and family before, so it would have been really incredibly difficult. Many children's parents had to stay in the cities to work, so the children were often evacuated on their own. Imagine how it must feel to be told you're leaving your parents, you're going someplace strange, you'd be living in a stranger's house with them, and that you might not see your parents for up to a year. Remember, these children were told that they were going to be evacuated until the war ended, but nobody knew when that would be. So if you look at the picture, study the picture closely, their mothers are saying goodbye to them at the railway station in this picture, and the children are about to travel on a train to a rural countryside area to live with strangers. So I want you to think for a moment, how do you think they must feel? Put yourself inside their shoes. Now, I believe that a picture can really tell a story. So have a look for a moment at these images of children who were being evacuated. Can you see just how young some of these children are? Can you spot that little girl clinging onto her teddy? Or the little boy peering out the window with his sisters, possibly waving goodbye to their mum, not knowing when they would see her again, when they would be reunited? Can you spot that little girl looking out the window with that tie around her neck with a little piece of card attached? And all children who were evacuated had that. It had their name and their address on in case they got lost. Remember, it was often huge groups of children being evacuated all at once, whole schools. So there was a possibility that some of these children could have gotten lost. Also was an address for whoever they were staying with to post a letter home to their parents, informing them how they were getting on, how they were settling in. Can you spot the boxes also tied around their necks containing their gas masks? Have a look, have a close look. Can you read their faces? Can you read their expressions? How do you think they're feeling? How would you feel if you were in their position? So when the children finally arrived in the rural area, there were always lots of adults waiting for them, waiting to pick them up. They usually went to their village hall or sometimes a school hall. Now, the adults were allowed to pick the children that they wanted to come and live with them. So many children had to wait for quite a long time until they were picked by an adult. Sometimes children would have to wait while all the other children around them were picked. Imagine how anxious they must have felt. Brothers and sisters would be picked together mostly, but there were times when brothers and sisters had to be split up and go to live with different families. They might not see each other again for a whole year. Now, some children were lucky because they got to live with families who were kind to them and lived in well-furnished houses with bathrooms and toilets inside. Some were not so lucky and had to live in small, cramped houses with no bathroom, only an outside toilet. And sometimes the people did not treat them well or in a loving way like their own family would have. Many children had never been to the countryside before. They'd only ever lived in their homes in their cities. So they were completely shocked and in awe and excited by the huge area of rural and farmland around them, the countryside. They'd never experienced it before. All that green. City children often wrote letters to their parents describing the different animals that they saw, such as cows and sheep for the first time. Just look at those views, those picturesque rolling hills. Incredible. Now, many of the children who were evacuated went to live on farms, and that makes sense. They were obviously sent to rural countryside areas. So as well as going to school, which most children had the opportunity to, they also had to help out around the farm, help the farmer. So for many city children, this was an incredible experience because they got to do things they would have never done before. Feeding, cleaning, riding horses, milking cows, cleaning out the pigsty, feeding the chickens and collecting their precious eggs. And although these experiences sound really exciting and incredible, remember, some of these tasks and jobs the children had to do would have been quite difficult, quite grueling. So evacuee children would work in the farmers' fields, often before school, after school, at the weekends and during the holidays. So they were made, they really had to earn their keep. Some of them really had to work hard. All year round, they would help to dig up potatoes, carrots, onions, cabbages, turnips. In the summer, they would pick the fruits from the farmers' trees, the apples, pears, plums and cherries, and I'm sure they stole a few along the way. And in autumn, picking the blackberries. And the reason for this was because food was scarce at the time, because of rationing. So all of the veg and fruit that the children were helping the farmers to grow in their fields or back gardens or in wasteland, this was all essential as Britain were suffering from food shortages because of the war. And in the 1940s, the government had to ration food. Now, rationing means that each person was only allowed a certain amount of food. And the types of food that were rationed, it wasn't all food, but things like meat, tea, jam, eggs, canned food, milk, these were all the items, the food items that were rationed during World War II. So we're going to focus mainly on two skills in our questions this week. So the first one is inference. Remember, use what you've read to come to a conclusion. That's what inference is. Form an opinion by reading between the lines. Remember, read the line before, read the line after. Come to that, make that opinion or come to that conclusion based on what you've read. Provide evidence from the text to back up your answer or your point is really important. So remember, point and evidence or point and explanation as to why you feel a certain way. The second skill that we're going to focus on is retrieval, fact retrieval. So it's where we've got to find and fetch the information from the text. So make sure you read that question. Make sure it's clear what information you need to find out. It's essential that you skim and scan to find the key words from the questions, which will help you to find and locate that information in the text. And then you've got to copy the information exactly as it's written. Remember, don't just try and remember, find it, fetch it. Find those key words to ensure you've fetched the correct information from the text. So the key vocabulary for the text we're going to be reading, billeting officer, and this is the person whose job it was to find a suitable home for the evacuees when they arrived. And there's a picture, I've placed a picture there of a billeting officer, and the important point to note is that they wore an armband which signified that that was their role, that they were the person in charge, they were the billeting officer, and that's important when it comes to the extract we see with Goodnight Mr. Tom, because it refers to that. Declaration of war was imminent, means an announcement had been made that the war was about to start, so they knew they were on the threshold of war was about to begin. Evacuated is forced to leave. and dialect. Now, the story is set in Dorset, which is down in southern England. And when you read the direct speech that Tom from Tom, so when Tom speaks in the story, it's not that the author has made spelling mistakes or spelling errors, but how Tom speaks, his pronunciation is very different. His grammar, the words that he uses are very different from standard English, the way that we speak. And that's normal for the area that he lived in. That was the local dialect or the way that they spoke. And it will make more sense as we read through the text and see some examples of that. Okay, so I'm going to read through 2 extracts with you from the story that we have chosen, which is Goodnight, Mr. Tom. And the reason we chose this story is because it tells the tale of a young boy named Willie who was evacuated during World War II from London to Dorset, which is in the south of England. And as we go through these 2 different extracts, we're going to look at our 2 key skills, which is first of all retrieval, and then we'll be moving on to some inference. And as I read through, I'll be doing a little teacher talk aloud and doing a little bit of inference myself as I go through, just to model to you guys. Yes, said Tom bluntly and opening the front door. What do you want? A stressed, middle-aged woman in a green coat and felt hat stood on his step. He glanced at the armband on her sleeve. She gave an awkward smile. I'm the billeting officer from this area, she began. Now this part suggests that Tom is quite a bad-tempered, grumpy, cranky individual because of the way he was so very rude towards the lady upon opening the door. It also suggests that her job as the billeting officer is very difficult, as maybe not everyone wanted to take in a refugee, which would have made her a very unpopular visitor and made her, as the author chose very wisely, that adjective is stressed when he described her, a stressed middle-aged woman. So we can infer why she feels so stressed, because of the pressure her job placed her under. Oh yes, and what's that got to do with me? She flushed slightly. Well, Mr. The fact that she flushed slightly suggests that she felt embarrassed, perhaps at the way she had been spoken to and her welcome by Mr. Oakley, by Thomas, or perhaps she felt embarrassed and uncomfortable at the question she was going to put to the proposal she was going to put to her towards Mr. Oakley. Oakley, Thomas Oakley. Ah, thank you, Mr. Oakley. She paused and took a deep breath. Mr. Oakley, with the declaration of war imminent? Tom waved his hand. I knows all that. Get to the point. What do you want? He noticed a small boy at her side. Now Tom waved his hand suggests he was getting annoyed or irritated at what she was trying to tell him. As to him, this was common knowledge. Everyone knew about the declaration of war being imminent. So what we're going to look at now is a retrieval question, and we're going to remind ourselves of top tips for answering a retrieval question correctly. So remember, we've got to, when we're retrieving, we're finding and fetching the information. The information is there, we've just got to find it. It's so important that you read the question. What information do you need to find? Underline your key words. What are you looking for? And I always read my question twice. And once we've found our keywords, then we need to skim and scan our text to locate them, to find them. And then we copy the information exactly as it has been written. Don't just try to remember. So if you pause your computer for a moment, press pause for a moment, and have a go. What do you think the answer is? Can you find it? Remember to use the top tips. Okay, so let's take a closer look. So I'm going to read my question again. What did the billeting officer do before telling Mr. Oakley about the declaration of war being imminent? So I've underlined declaration of war because that's what she said to him. They are the words that she spoke. They're the key words we're looking for. And I've also underlined before because I'm looking for the information. What did she do before she spoke those words? So you can see in my text that I have skimmed and scanned, and I found those keywords, declaration of war is imminent. And I've looked before that, and there is my answer. She paused and took a deep breath. So my answer is the billeting officer paused and took a deep breath. How did you guys do? I hope you followed your top tips. So we're moving on to our second passage now, and this time we're going to focus on an inference question. I'm going to read the passage first. It's him I've come about, she said. I'm on my way to our village hall with the others. What others? She stepped to one side. Behind the large iron gate which stood at the end of the graveyard were a small group of children. Many of them were filthy and very poorly dressed. Only a handful had a blazer or coat. One tiny dark-haired girl in the front was hanging firmly on to a new teddy bear. The woman touched the boy at her side and pushed him forward. There's no need to tell me, said Tom. It's obligatory, and it's for the war effort. So let's have a look at our question again. How do you think the children were feeling? And explain why. So when we're answering inference questions, here's our top tips. So we've got to use what we've read to come to a conclusion. We've also got to form an opinion by reading between the lines. Now we know these children are evacuees. We know from all the research that we've done in the build up to our reading and in the build up to our writing, we know a lot about what evacuees have gone through to get to where these are now, standing outside these man's house or on their way to their local village hall to be selected by a stranger to go and live with. So that's going to be important with this question, reading between the lines. The answer mightn't be there, but using all the clues, using all the evidence, using what you know about the lives of these evacuees to form an opinion. Remember to provide evidence from the text to back up your points. So remember, point plus evidence. So make your point, but you must have evidence to back it up. Or make your point and you must have an explanation to build it up, depending on exactly what type of inference question it is. So pause your computer or press pause for a couple of minutes and have a go. Why do you or how do you think the children were feeling, and can you explain why? So I've had a go at answering this question too. How do you think the children were feeling, and explain why? Now, there were different options that you could have chosen. You could have started by saying they're feeling anxious. And remember, reading between the lines, we know these children are evacuees. We know they've been taken from their homes because they were in danger. We know that these particular children don't have any parents with them. So I think that these children feel anxious because they didn't know who was going to take them in and whether they would be treated kindly. You could also have said that they're feeling miserable, lonely, or homesick because they had been taken away from their families. Or you could have said they're exhausted after their long train journey to the countryside. Some of them had probably not slept well the night before, as they may have been feeling anxious. Or in some of the accounts that I've read, some of the children were actually really excited. They looked at it as kind of a holiday. So maybe some of them couldn't sleep because they were excited about being evacuated. Once you have given your own opinion and once you can back it up with a sound explanation, you guys might have come up with a different point and a different explanation to me, but once it's a sensible one. We hope you enjoy the pack. Remember your top tips when you are retrieving from your text, when you are answering inference questions. We hope you enjoy the text. And remember, if you do have any questions or if you're stuck on any questions, please give us a message through our Teams. And one final thing, I have highlighted the word obligatory there. Now this word, it's not included in our key vocab because that is one of your challenges. It's obligatory and it's for the war effort. So what do you think? Can you clarify the meaning of that word obligatory for me? From what you've read, from the evidence that is there, can you think of a word that has a similar meaning? What do you think the term obligatory means? Okay, good luck everyone. Hope you enjoy the pack and chat to you all again soon.